welcome to the fourth module in our anti-racism series. In the first three modules, you explored the roots of colonialism and whiteness, positionality, privilege, and bias to develop your own pedagogy in anti-racism. In Module 4, our goal is to provide the framework for understanding and empowering Black excellence through Africentric education and cultivating Black joy in language courses. We are your hosts for Module 4. I'm Joseph Galawango, a learning coach in the TDXB with a background in secondary education, English, social sciences, and Africentric education.
And I am Monique Willisey, an FSL teacher with the TDSB with a background in elementary and secondary education, social justice and equity, English, and history.
This module, Africentric Education and Black Joy, will explore the principles of anti-racist education and present different levels of engagement with anti-racism, offering small but actionable steps that FSL educators can take within their personal and professional lives. We would like to use some guiding questions to set the context for what we will be sharing with you in this module. Ask yourself these questions in the tradition of self-reflection with the intention of establishing how ready we are for this learning. We would suggest that part of our best practices as educators is consistent critical self-assessment. The first set of questions are, have you been trained in including contributions from the African diaspora into your teaching? How will you incorporate new information about past and present contributions from the African continent into your teaching? What personal biases about African cultures, contributions, and people might you hold consciously or unconsciously? How will you set conditions for an intersectional approach in your practice which opens space for various African identities and expressions?
The second set of questions that will be used to set the context for this module are, have you read and studied any of the writers and thinkers du mouvement de la négritude? What Francophone literature are we as educators embracing for ourselves and transferring that knowledge and insight to our students? Are educators doing an adequate job of ensuring that our resources support the diversity in our classrooms and Africentric pedagogy? When have you seen yourself reflected in French reading experience? And lastly, what was a language book that made you think or act differently?
Dismantling Eurocentrism. It is also important that we share our intentions for this module to be a tool for educators to use in their ongoing dismantling of Eurocentrism. It was created as a resource to support dismantling Eurocentric ideals, which have contributed to anti-Black racism on institutional, idealistic, and interpersonal levels. Eurocentric ideals such as Eurocentric standards of beauty or valuing European art forms above others, in particular those created by Black people, are still widely practiced and cause harm to students, educators, and communities. Critical reflection of how Black voices and identities are included in our practice is essential to Africentric education and to anti-racist education.
Contributions from Africa. But before we start with this topic, we invite you to pause and reflect on the following questions as we go through this section of the module. What do you seek to understand about pre-colonial Africa? What do you wonder? Have you experienced Sankofa principles in your education? Why or why not? In what ways can your past inform your future? How might looking back at pre-colonial African civilizations, philosophies, and perspectives reshape ideas about Blackness? What do you know about pre-colonial Africa? What informs this knowledge? If it is limited or non-existent, why do you think you have this gap in knowledge? Africa is the second largest continent in the world. The countries of China, India, and the United States, and most of Europe could fit within the borders of Africa. Africa is the birthplace of humanity, with some human fossils dating to 7 million years ago. Around 2,000 different languages are spoken in Africa, and each of them have different dialects. Arabic is the most widely spoken language in the continent, followed by English. According to l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, there are 321 million French speakers, mais 255 millions de personnes vivent aussi en français, c'est-à-dire qu'ils font un usage quotidien de la langue, même si les contextes sont variés. This makes Africans and the African diaspora the largest Francophone communities. This representation of a colonial language is complex. One of the strategies to ensure that French continues to be acknowledged and used in these regions and others is to use culturally relevant pedagogy. There is a need to honor and understand the presence of the African diaspora, culture, and traditions in the face of post-colonialism. In modern languages, specifically French, it is important to show the positive side of l'Afrique francophone, their accomplishments and resilience. La progression du nombre de francophones en Afrique étant une constante depuis quelques années, la répartition des locuteurs de français s'est profondément modifiée, tout comme se sont transformés les usages de cette langue dans des contextes essentiellement plurilingues qui caractérisent le continent africain. Even with some of these contemporary and historical contributions, there is still this myth of Africa as a dark continent that persists, a term given by Welsh journalist and explorer Henry Morton Stanley. The dark myth means a place without culture, achievements, social institutions that are comparable to European accomplishments. Such myths were invented by Europeans simply to justify colonization, slavery, and the belief in their racial superiority. The negative representation of Africa is not simply historical. In fact, it has persisted and evolved to the present. In a post-colonial world, the largest avenue of Euro-American cultural imperialism is Hollywood. This monolithic negative view must be changed and truthfully has been challenged from the Negritude movement in the 1930s all the way to the modern Pan-Africanism born from the anti-colonial struggle into the 2000s with the idea of the African Renaissance and dismantling anti-Black racism. In modern language courses, in order to present content through a lens of Black joy, it is fundamentally important to understand why the Dark Continent myth was created, how it has evolved, continues, and how to dismantle it. This quote from Enlightenment philosophers like David Hume summarize the supposed blackout of African civilization. I suspect the Negroes, and in general all other species of men, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilization of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturer among them, no art, no science. Much of Africa's evidence of civilization and culture was relocated to Europe and Asia, robbing the people of the continent and diaspora of physical artifacts, but this did not rob them of the narrative storytelling culture that endures. In many films used in French classes, there is an unintentional use of whiteness and the savior complex as the standard mechanism of othering and comparing. Most people wouldn't think of a film like Carmen G before a film like Amélie, and they came out around the same time. Amélie is actually an obsolete vision. It is a nostalgia for old France, but what France was that? It was just a paradise for white people, not at all for minorities. And that is something people still do not understand. For almost 2,500 years, from 850 BCE to 1600 CE, cultures and civilizations thrived throughout Africa, including the kingdoms of Aksum, Ghana, Zimbabwe, empires of Songhai and Mali. With the exception of ancient Egypt, however, most Westerners are unaware of them. Past African civilizations are solemnly studied in schools or discussed in the media. By examining the rise and the development of ancient civilizations in Africa, we discover how modern Research has dispensed with the view that the people of Africa had no history, culture, technological, scientific, or economic advances of their own. We shed light on the realities underlying the progress of society and civilizations in Africa and the continent's contributions to human advancement. Many times, FSL teachers will ask students to do an inquiry into famous or important Francophone people for various assessments, whether they are writing, reading, speaking, or listening. In this regard, it is important that educators reflect and ensure that they are authentically including people from the African diaspora. This could include the Agoji from the Kingdom of Dahomey, Marie Ndie, Mansa Musa, King Gizo Tassihembe, Toussaint Louverture, Joseph Bologne, Aïssa Maïga, Gertie Archimède, or even Paulette Nardal.
Africentric education. An Africentric perspective is when educators connect their practice to the ideas and achievements that come from the African continent and its people. An Afrocentric perspective recognizes and affirms the life experiences of all students, regardless of gender, place of origin, religion, ethnicity and race, cultural and linguistic background, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, age, or ability. Afrocentric curriculum is meant to be a critical approach to thinking about the curriculum and the nature of curricular knowledge. All materials and subject areas can be adapted to an Afrocentric perspective. Afrocentrism promotes and infuses African knowledge, worldviews, and perspectives, or African ways of knowing and understanding our world, into the mainstream curriculum of our schools. An Afrocentric perspective to education is also presenting a contrast to the dominant Eurocentric perspective, allowing students to value contributions from Africans that can contribute to their positive identity development. We would like to remind educators that Afrocentric pedagogy is not an exclusive heroes and holidays approach meant to make Eurocentric curriculum more diverse without disrupting it. It is also not curriculum solely about the systems of slavery, in particular, African enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade, the enslavement of African peoples, or the Mafa, which translates to Great Disaster in Kiswahili. We would like to now connect Afrocentric thinking and Afrocentric education to the concept of Black Joy. There are several ways the phrase Black Joy can be defined, just as there are limitless ways that one's blackness can be expressed. We offer you 3 questions to think deeply about on your own as we engage with the phenomenon of Black Joy. Number 1, what is Black Joy, and how do you know it when you see it? Number 2, why might Black Joy be considered distinctly from any other joy that people experience? Number 3, how might Black Joy fit into a pedagogy that is Afrocentric and also culturally relevant and responsive? For the sake of the learning in this module, we will develop our own understanding of what Black Joy is. Let's start with some humor from our ancestors. During times of oppression and trauma, their resolve was often expressed through various types of carefully guarded joy and wisdom shared among them. Some comments like this are an example. Our joy is something no white man can steal from us. We invite educators to critically consider how Black Joy has always existed in times of happiness and in times of unhappiness. Regarding how Black Joy might be understood more deeply, Tracy Michelle Lewis Gidgetts, author of the book Black Joy, Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration, writes, Black Joy is unique and deeply rooted in cultural experiences and expressions of Black people across the diaspora. Connecting Gidget's excerpt to an Afrocentric perspective of history will allow us to think critically about how Black cultural experiences have existed closely with trauma from anti-Blackness over the last few centuries. Therefore, we remind educators that Black Joy has also been a practice of resistance and healing. One of the most significant expressions of Black Joy is Black people proudly loving who and what they are. Black Joy, shown through self-love, is a practice that predates colonialism and Eurocentric ideals. Gidgetts expands on this concept by suggesting that when the foundations of Black Joy are self-love and empathy, we can make room for all the ways our humanity shows up, good, bad, and ugly. The joy can live alongside the pain. If we are thinking critically about how we connect Black joy with self-love, resistance, and humanity being expressed in diverse ways, we then might begin to understand our discussion questions more clearly and think about how these concepts will manifest in our learning spaces. Educators, specifically FSL educators, might consider an example of connecting Black joy and self-love to African traditions of art that honors womanhood and fertility, such as the traditional artwork from the Bambara people of Mali. We pose the question to educators and your students: how can your research help you identify examples of Black self-love in pre- and post-colonial Africa, as well as the contemporary diaspora? Your research, used in an inclusive, culturally responsive, and relevant way, will surely bring up the numerous examples of trauma that has occurred over time to Black people. In his historical text, Black and British, David Olusoga describes human exhibits which use the dehumanization of captured African people who were put on displays in shows similar to traveling circus acts full of freakish and exotic attractions throughout Europe in the 1800s. These exhibits were widely popular, entertained white people, and created devastating realities for the Africans who were forced to participate in them. Through your research, you might also encounter one of the most infamous examples of Black bodies being objectified and destroyed through colonialism. This example is of Sarah Bartman, a South African woman named Sarjdi, aka Sarah Bartman, was one of the most memorable Africans exploited, abused, and featured in these exhibits. 2 centuries ago, Sarah Bartman died after years spent in European freak shows. Sarah Bartman died on December 29, 1815, but her exhibition continued. Her brain, skeleton, and sexual organs remained on display in a Paris museum until 1974. Her remains weren't repatriated and buried until 2002. Brought to Europe seemingly on false pretenses by a British doctor, her stage name was Hottentot Venus, and she was paraded around freak shows in London and Paris, with crowds invited to gawk at her curvaceous buttocks and curves, while ignoring her humanity and natural beauty. As educators who are engaging in challenging work, we encourage you to embed culturally responsive teaching into your practice. This pedagogical theory, founded by Gloria Ladson-Billings, consists of building cultural competence in students, having high expectations of students, and using their learning experiences to develop a sense of critical consciousness. The possibilities of connecting Black joy to rich learning are limited only by the capacity of the educator and their students. What about carnival? Carnival. Consider Black joy and its various expressions as an opportunity to study the history and significance of carnival across the Caribbean, the Americas, and the African continent. The joy expressed in carnival can be an invitation to engage with multiple facets of carnivals which take place every year all over the world.
In a language environment, this is a perfect opportunity to explore culture. Carnival examples such as Carnaval de Guadeloupe is one of the longest at almost 2 months. It was introduced by colonists, but now local culture, majority of Guadeloupe's population is Creole, most of whom are a mix of African Black and European White, followed by Black and French Amérindien, is emphasized throughout the carnival. It is a moment of celebration, but also of preservation of culture as one of the few remaining dum-tums.
Consider these 2 questions about carnival being a vehicle to critically engage with Black joy. Question 1. What other resources which center Black celebrations and traditions might you use to incorporate culturally responsive and representative deep learning as well as wellness? Question 2. How could you use these resources to deepen your own understanding of anti-Black racism and dismantling anti-Black stereotypes? Black joy and bias. Black joy is often misrepresented as something threatening because of implicit bias and racism. How might media and films like When They See Us allow educators and their students to explore implicit bias and anti-Black racism? Black bodies are safest when their expressions are in accordance with what the dominant culture demands. Black joy, especially expressions by boys, is something that has resulted in black boys and young men being killed, harmed, or threatened with death by people acting out violent white supremacist ideals. Several texts from black thinkers around the world have contributed insight into the historic and contemporary danger that black bodies have been placed in because of white supremacy. There are rich opportunities to incorporate these established voices into your language practice and connect them with the voices and perspectives from other parts of the black French-speaking diaspora. Francophone films in the last few years have seen a new generation of black creators making films about the black experience and its plurality. These films span topics related to immigrant and feminist struggles of today and all in between. Unfortunately, this does not mean that access to these films are universal or even known. We would like to offer these 3 questions to educators for further reflection on Black Joy in film. Number 1, does the film or media tap into students' interests, prior knowledge, and diverse representation of French language use? Number 2, does the resource reinforce, perpetuate, or highlight stereotypes or misrepresentations of specific groups and identities? Number 3, how might you address these misrepresentations before, after, or during use?
The next section looks at Black plurality, and we start with this quote. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Teaching through Black people and not about Black people. This means listening, writing, and teaching narratives from the actual experiences, lenses, and voices of Black people. This is incredibly important when you are an educator in a language that has been used to misrepresent and hide the rich and complex tapestry of the African diaspora. In The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, George Lipset points out that whiteness has a cash value and creates immense profit for its club members. It is a delusion that has no valid foundation in biology or anthropology. Whiteness is, however, a social construct, an identity created and continued with all too real consequences for the distribution of wealth, prestige, and opportunity. We know all humans have the same collection of genes, and the whole idea of different races is a misconception. Some of the questions to think and reflect on in this section include: how does whiteness grant certain privileges when selecting educational material? How might white people experience oppression through other social identities? For example, class, gender, sexual orientation, religion, ability, etc. How does whiteness leave out other cultures? How can educators confront their fragility around racial identity to build on their emotional stamina? Whiteness for centuries was used to try to solidify the supposed superiority of Europeans. In French, we can see this with the various denials about racism in both France and Quebec. In 2020, Quebec's Premier François Legault declared there's no systemic discrimination, no system in Quebec of discrimination. This is in spite of a 2019 report from 3 independent researchers that actually found that there was systemic biases in street checks done by Montreal police. The report goes on to say that it found that Indigenous people and Black people were 4 to 5 times more likely than white people to be stopped by the police. Indigenous women were particularly overrepresented. They were 11 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white women, and young Arab people between the ages of 15 and 24 were 4 times more likely than white people of the same age to be targeted by street checks. France, as another example, does not collect any race-based data, and both of these systems make any push towards dismantling anti-Black racism and centering Black joy much more difficult, especially without empirical evidence. In most Franco-European countries, there are small steps being taken to tell the untold stories of Black people, but many are still using tropes to do this. Many of the films that we see still play into these tropes about Black bodies, mannerisms, and behaviors being othered in comparison to white bodies, mannerisms, and behaviors. In many French films, the Black actors rarely take a starring role. This is not to diminish these minor roles. However, if teachers want to bring about more positive representation, it is important to actively search for multifaceted representation. French films and shows tend to portray Black people into categories, with many of them originating from les banlieues, illegal immigrants, and criminals. OMLTA has done other films than Les Intouchables. However, it is the most notable one. This film is important. In using it, it is important to explain that the film also has many aspects of reinforcing tropes of the dark continent and whiteness and othering that need to be discussed as well. Throughout the film, he is brilliant and deserving of all the accolades that he has received. However, he is also the magical Negro, a former criminal from Les Banlieues in the film, who transforms the life of this very wealthy quadriplegic man. When selecting films or other media, it is important to consider some of the following questions. Pause and think. Have you attempted to find resources written and directed by people who represent the multifaceted nature of the Franco-African diaspora? Does the resource encourage students to develop their intercultural awareness by recognizing their own identities, cultural legacies, and lived experiences along with those of diverse French-speaking communities?
We would like to introduce the next segment of our module, Problematizing Black Excellence. The questions we would like to start the segment off with are, what is the meaning of Black excellence? First question. Second question, what are the effects of Black excellence on Black wellness? Third question, how can educators explore Black excellence in a way that supports Africentric education? We also encourage educators and their students to deeply explore how excellence is a standard that is often developed by oppressive Eurocentric dominant culture. Concepts such as excellence, exceptionalism, and superiority can often come at the expense of other ideas such as humanity, justice, and wellness. The concept of Black excellence, if not carefully and critically considered, can produce the following problematic narratives among students, educators, and community members at large: diminishing the value of everyday people and what everyday people experience and contribute to society, an affinity to classist and elitist ideals. Another problematic outcome might be an affinity for standards established by white supremacy, which are sustained by oppression and the exploitation of Black people globally and throughout the African continent. And lastly, an ignorance or dismissal of systemic social and economic inequities that have disproportionately affected Black people throughout history. If not carefully and critically considered, Black excellence can contribute to the type of thinking about Black people and students known as Black exceptionalism, which has been characterized in popular discourse as the notion that Black people who are educated, smart, artistic, poised, and basically every other positive adjective you can think of are atypical or rarities among the general Black population. The writer and cultural critic Janice Gassam Asare describes the negative effects of Black exceptionalism as something that, quote, does not allow Black children to be children. Striving for big goals and aiming to improve one's performance in any domain is admirable. That is not a criticism of that. This is, rather, an interrogation of our society's obsession with Black exceptionalism. Black exceptionalism encourages Black people to sacrifice their health, mental well-being, and welfare for the sake of greatness. Black excellence is an unreachable peak Nothing is ever good enough. Black excellence is insatiable. There's always one more mountain to climb. Black excellence is not sustainable. Asari also poses the question to all of us, and what happens to the black people that society does not recognize as excellent? The idea of black excellence can also be quite divisive. History and systemic racism have had a part in identifying black people who are exceptional and heroic, and in turn identifying other black people and their contributions to history and labeling them as problematic. We invite educators to think critically about who is considered heroic, who is and who is not, and also who benefits from these distinctions.
In our final section, we are looking at value, celebrate, and recognition in language courses. The question that I want you to consider as we go through this section is, how do teachers value and celebrate and recognize and integrate students and people into what they are teaching? A people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Marcus Garvey. As we study the history of Black liberation and expression and examples of Black people in their various cultures, how can we continue to support each other and our educational growth? One of the most important concepts for educators to understand and apply is racial literacy. Racial literacy urges educators to take a close look at an institutionalized system like school and examine it for the ways in which its structure affects students of color. Educators who develop racial literacy are able to discuss with their students and with each other the implications of race and the negative effects of racism in ways that can potentially transform their teaching. This was something pointed out and developed by Dr. Yolanda Sealy Ruiz. Another important strategy for FSL educators to incorporate into their practice is the use of layered text. Layered text, according to Dr. Goldie Muhammad, should help students understand local, national, and global communities and incite social critique, and should support historically responsive literacy framework. The use of layered text could, for example, include the use or access to standard French dictionaries and francophone dictionaries. Dictionnaire des francophones, un dictionnaire en ligne, illustre la variété et la richesse de la langue. C'est parce que le dictionnaire des francophones a vocation à regrouper le plus grand nombre possible de variétés du français. Le dictionnaire des francophones est un outil numérique. Comme tel, il est cumulatif, faisant accéder aux principaux dictionnaires et bases de données en ligne, alimente savoir déjà accumulé sur le français et qu'il importe de mettre à la disposition de tous. Il offre à chacun de contribuer à cette connaissance, mots nouveaux, sens neufs, définitions, d'enrichir encore le grand trésor des mots francophones. Interactif, il est en constante évolution, telle la langue elle-même. Other examples of layered text could also include poetry, short stories, photography, and films from the diverse francophonie. Example using poetry is A Rain of Words. It's a bilingual anthology of women's poetry in Afrique. Almost none of these poems have been published outside of Africa or Europe, and this really allows teachers to introduce and interact with the material. Bilingual nature allows students to interact with the material from different entry points as well. When using any text, teachers need to also ensure the explicit teaching of this learning experience in terms of what they are asking students to do and the outcomes, the measurable outcomes. An example of this is challenging the resource as it relates to issues of equity and power, social justice, to inform a critical stance, response, and or action. Asking and answering questions based on key details in the resource, understanding fact versus opinion, analyzing character and their traits, making inferences and drawing conclusions, summarizing main points of a story or text or retelling the story or text, self-monitoring for comprehension and meaning making, making predictions, analyzing cause and effect relationships, identifying and using text and graphic features, understanding of literary elements and features in fiction in French, students developing francophone vocabulary, identifying of main ideas and or central messages in the text, encouraging students to bring home francophone language and culture into learning activities, evaluating the author's purpose, theme, and point of view, biases, for example, comparing and contrasting, and finally making connections to themselves and others in the text. Now, obviously, the use of these above strategies are great and wonderful. However, we do need the resources to use in order to actually apply. And many French teachers have difficulty finding resources that highlight voices of Francophone diaspora written from their perspective. One example is Life in Yup City. It's a graphic novel from the 2000s, and it's published and focuses on Aya, a young girl living her daily life in Yopougon, Côte d'Ivoire. There are plenty of teachers who know about this graphic novel and its sequel. What is fascinating is the lens from which the graphic novel uses. It is a graphic novel that focuses on the joy of daily life. There is no trauma or single focus on the struggles of post-colonial life. Côte d'Ivoire achieved independence in 1960, and this novel is very deliberately set in post-colonial Côte d'Ivoire. Another source is Phare Libre. So this is a 6-part podcast that highlights the diversity in Canadian history that is often overlooked. The stories and histories cover a range from le programme de recrutement de domestiques, l'histoire tragique de Marie-Joseph Angélique, Ariane Chad, et même l'évolution de la diaspora haïtienne au Québec dans les années 1960 et 1970. So what is so historically fascinating about this resource is that it meets so many expectations for culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy and historically responsive literacy. The podcast series is produced by Media Girlfriends, a production company founded by journalists who focus on issues surrounding diversity. And the series itself is meant to contribute to correcting the errors and omissions in Canadian history. Centering all of this, we come back to Dr. Goldie Muhammad and her 5 pursuits, this idea of culture-centered literacy model. Muhammad explains that the pursuits can be used and layered with math, science, English, language, social studies, physical education, health. These pursuits should receive equal consideration and priority. This is uniquely important for French educators because some of us are core, some of us are immersion, some of us are francophone educators. The chart demonstrates the questions educators should be asking themselves when thinking about how these pursuits will look in the classroom. For identity, this idea that the ability is to understand the self within local and broader contexts of reading and signs of the time. So the question I ask is, how will my instruction help students learn something about themselves and or about others? Skills, cognitive acts of reading, writing, and speaking skills. How will my instruction build students' skills for the content area? Next, we have intellectualism, gaining knowledge across areas. Literacy development as a route for all learning. Literacy is not one subject or one educator. It is broad across every subject. How will my instruction build students' knowledge and mental power? Criticality. Using literacy as a step towards social change. How will my instructions engage students thinking about power and equity and the disruption of oppression? And lastly, joy. How will youth see joy in themselves and in others? Muhammad explains that the four layers are not separated, but progressive, each one building on the layers of the one that came before. And this starts with identity and it ends with joy. As we conclude our module, we will leave you with a few reflection questions in your journey towards embedding Black joy in your curricular areas and classrooms. These are the questions that we had focused on starting at the beginning, but now we've picked a few to really anchor your reflection here at the end. How will you incorporate new information about past and present contributions from the African continent into your teachings? What personal biases about African culture, contributions, and people might you hold consciously or unconsciously? How will you set conditions for an intersectional approach in your practice, which opens space for various African identities and expressions? What Francophone literature and intellects are we as educators embracing for ourselves and transferring that knowledge and insight to our students? And finally, as educators, are we doing an adequate job of ensuring that our resources support the diversity in our classrooms and Africentric pedagogy?
We'd like to share some final thoughts with all who have participated in this module. As you continue to develop your skills as critical language educators, please do so in the spirit of ongoing learning. Keep these 4 suggestions, as well as all the other elements we've explored together in this module, centered in your work with students. Start with Black Joy. Celebrate Black achievements, past, present, and future. Acknowledge African influences, and recognize all the various wonderful expressions of Blackness and Black culture around and across the globe and throughout history. Do these things as you continue to learn and create new possibilities with your students. Thank you.
Your support and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey. Should you have any questions or comments about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a nonprofit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international languages teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. These modules were designed to support FSL teachers to becoming anti-racist FSL educators through the development of the foundations presented in this series so they may feel more comfortable, confident, and equipped to be equitable and inclusive in their second language learning classrooms in a manner that is sincere and authentic. The OMLTA would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing this module series. In addition, a special thanks goes to the educators who contributed their expertise and their experience to the creation and development of these modules.